Hello, good day and welcome once again to the Tobago House of Assemblies Division of Education, Innovation and Energy's e-learning program. I am Kimarie Richardson Thomas and I'm your presenter as we continue to look at our CSEC English A. So let's take a look at Island Man. Morning, and the island man wakes up to the sound of blue surf in his head, the steady breaking and booming, wild seabirds and fishermen pushing out to sea, the sun surfacing defiantly. From the east of his small emerald island, he always comes back groggily, comes back to sands of a grey metallic soar, to surge of wheels, to dull north circular roar. Muffling, his crumpled pillow waves, island man heaves himself. Another London day. Let's do an analysis of this poem before we look at questions that we can explore for poetry. So this is the poem Island Man. And the poet, when she wrote it, she gives a link to what this poem is about, who it's for. She links it so it's a clear link with other traditions. It is for a Caribbean island man in London who still wakes up to the sound of the sea. So there's this memory, even though he is in London, the sound of the sea, and the fact that we're reading it, he wakes up to the sound of the sea. We know he's not by the sea. So it tells us, and it should tell you as you read it, he remembers. Even though he's far away from home, the fact that he's waking up to the sound of the sea, this is a memory. It is not an actual event. So we have morning, and the island man wakes up to the sound of blue surf in his head. What we have here is an alliteration with the letter S. Sound of the blue surf in his head. What we're also going to identify as you go through, pay attention to colors, because we have vibrant colors here by the blue, and we're going to see another one lower down in the poem. So he's waking up to the sound of blue surf in his head, the steady breaking and wooming. Now, the word wooming, you need to understand, it's not a word you come across very often, but it's a word that has many associations. It speaks about the womb. So the steady breaking and wooming, wild seabirds, we move on to the next line. But the word wooming, it's an image that speaks of comfort and security because it's associated with being in the womb. So we need to understand, why does the poet use that word? What is the idea the poet wants to convey by using a word like womb in this way? And what is the image that it conveys? So we have wild seabirds and fishermen pushing out to sea, the sun surfacing defiantly, and we see again, we have another alliteration. We still have the alliteration with the sea sounds, and that repetition of the S. That repetition of the S is so relevant, especially when we talk about the sea, sand and sea and surf and sun. All of these are words that are associated with the sea, and the repetition here of our S sound is very, very impactful. Pay attention as well that apart from talking about the sun surfacing, it speaks of how the sun surfaces. It's defiantly. Defiantly is a very positive image here, and it speaks about an attitude that says, regardless of what, I will. And you have to be able to see how the poet uses that in describing the actions of the sun. The sun surfacing defiantly, nothing can stop it. And that is what it speaks to as a strong and positive image. Nothing and no one can stop that sun from rising. We continue again, we have of a small emerald island. Again, we have a color image, vibrant colors. These are not dull colors. We have blue and emerald, colors that are always associated with the Caribbean. And then we come here, he always comes back groggily, groggily. And there's a repetition, as if he cannot believe it, as if he's reluctant to acknowledge, as if he's in a little daze, and you wake up where you're unsure and you're not sure if you're dreaming or is it real. The second part of this poem comes here. Comes back to sands of a grey metallic saw, to surge of wheels, to dull north circular road, muffling, his crumpled pillows waves, island man heaves himself, another London day. Now there is a contrast, and we have here the color contrast. It's no longer the vibrant blues and emerald greens of the Caribbean. He comes back to sands of gray metallic soul. So now he is awake and realizes he's not in the Caribbean anymore. He is in London. And there's that contrast of color, contrast of texture, contrast of sounds. The metallic soar to surge of wheels. And this metallic here is associated with the vehicles that are moving up and down, the buses and all of these noises that he may be hearing coming in. So you have that change of perspective. There's a busy road, the mention of the North Circular Road. If you are not aware of it, and again, this awareness comes from a lot of reading, you may not know what they're talking about, but you need to know that this is a road in London. Just as we had the groggily in the first part of the poem, we have here muffling, a repetition. He cannot believe. He's reluctant to acknowledge. Is this really where I am? I'm no longer home. And it's that waking up out of this cloud of sleep. And then we have island man heaves himself. It's a comparison of someone heaving themselves onto the island, as if you're emerging out of the sea and you're lifting yourself. He heaves himself, and then we have the stark contrast. And this stands by itself. That last line stands by itself, and that's for a reason. And we need to be able to figure this out. And here's what I want to tell you. Very often, the reasons that a poet may do something, when you're asked the question, your first impulse is usually right. Because poetry is such an emotional type of reading and relies heavily on the feelings of the reader. Many times, that conclusion that you've drawn is correct, and you second guess yourself. I want you to be a little more confident when you approach your poems. But here, another London day. This line stands by itself. It's a stark last line. It's physically isolated. There's no preposition or verb that would make it a complete sentence. And that isolation speaks of how Island Man feels. That last line is a clear picture of where he is and how he feels in London, isolated. All right? So we're going to take a look at how we can approach looking at a poem in terms of its structure and its meanings for answering questions for our multiple choice. And we're going to take this poem, Fini, and we'll explore it for the purposes of the multiple choice. So read the following poem carefully and then select your answer on the basis of what is stated or implied. And this is Fini by Eric Roach. Night casts its blanket on the wood, blacker than blindness. Nothing breaks midnight. Now the fireflies died. Life's candles flickered out. Darkness has entered at the pores of love and joy, and grief and art and song now songed in silence. Silence, silence. A man has passed into the heart of darkness. Our first question asks, it says here, this poem describes what? What does this poem describe? A man walking through darkness? Death of a man? C, life in Tobago? Or D, loneliness? And the poet, Eric Roach, is actually a Tobagonian poet. Just want to go back for you to take a picture. If you're following with us, take a picture. And let's look at this poem as we go through the questions. Take a picture with your smartphones. Night casts its blanket on the wood, blacker than blindness. Nothing breaks midnight. Now the fireflies died. Life's candles flickered out. Darkness has entered, and the pause of love and joy, and grief and art and song. Now song is silence, silence, silence. It continues actually, a man has passed into the heart of darkness. So it says the poem describes a man walking through darkness, death of a man, life in Tobago, or loneliness. It can be tricky in that there's some words that would make you think that someone is just walking through a dark space. And that is only when you read it and pull out some of the words. But you have to pay attention to the poem in its entirety, a holistic appreciation of the entire poem. And if you selected your answers, if your answer for number 1 is B, that is correct. The death of a man. Someone has died and has moved on. Number 2, which is an example of personification? Pay attention to your literary devices and be clear that you know what a personification is and you do not confuse personification with metaphor. This is a common error that many students can make. It asks which is an example of personification, and you're looking at what is an example of an element in the poem that gives human qualities to a non-human object. So, heart of darkness, A. B says night casts its blanket on the wood. C, nothing breaks midnight. And D, now fireflies die. Which one of these is an example of personification? And what we have is the act of doing something that's normally done by people. And if you selected B, night casts its blanket on the wood, so that night is the idea of night throwing a blanket over the wood, over the forest. But what it really speaks of, it is that nightfall. Number 2, the word candles in line 5 is used literally, ironically, sarcastically, or metaphorically. How is the word candles used in line 5? And I want you to go back, look at your poem. You have your poem in front of you, and it would have said that life's candles flickered out. The word candles there is not speaking about a literal candle. When we talk literally, we're speaking about what actually is, but it's not an actual candle. It's not ironic, and it's not sarcastic. It is being used in a figurative way as a metaphor, speaking about when life has come to an end, and the same way the candles can be blown out, snuffed out, so life's candles flickered out. So if you selected D, you are correct. Question 4. The expression sound is silence, silence, silence is an example of A, alliteration, B, assonance, C, onomatopoeia, or D, sibilance. Now, many of you can be tempted to think that, well, what we have here in this expression, sound is silence, silence, silence. What we are seeing, or what we can hear, is the repetition of this. And we know that this letter specifically, it's not a vowel, it's a consonant. And we see the repetition of this sound, and we can be tempted to think that it's an alliteration. However, when we are looking at the specific repetition of this sound, that S sound, it moves it out of just being exclusively under the realm of alliteration, and it's a specific kind of alliteration that is known as sibilance. This here is an example of our sibilance, and I want you to review it. Go look it up, and that you're aware of sibilance, and also I want you to look at consonants. Pay attention to sibilants and consonants. These are types of alliterations, and you want to be able to understand the distinction. Question 5. Man has passed is an example of A, euphemism, B, imagery, C, pun, D, symbolism. What does this phrase actually mean? Man has passed. When we look at our poem and we have identified that it's speaking about the passing or the death of someone, and they're speaking here, man has died. But it's looking for, it's stated in a softer way, rather than the harsh tone associated with a man has died. And the literary device, or the example that we use when we want to say something that's usually harsh in a softer way, is a euphemism. So that if you've selected A, that would be the correct answer. Let's take a look at the next question. The mood of the poem is best described as A, reflective, B, joyous, C, melancholic, D, nostalgic. Look at the question and I want you to select your answer. Reflective, a reflective mood is when we're thinking about things around us. We're thinking and recounting the past and how it impacts or how it affects what we want to do next. Making plans. Joyous is full of happiness and excitement, joy. Melancholic is associated with sadness. It's associated with grief and loss. Whereas nostalgic has to do with remembering your past, looking back in a fond way on things that took place before. So that based on these definitions, the mood of this poem can be best described as C, melancholic. There is grief and sadness associated with the mood that's created here. Number 7. We'll want to look at another type of poem because we're doing some practice. This is not number 7. Look at this poem. We're going to read the following poem carefully and then select your answer on the basis of what is stated or implied. And I didn't say it in the last one, but pay attention to here. What is stated or implied. When you're doing comprehension, all of the information is not going to be stated. I want you to remember, take your smartphones out, take a picture, save this so that as we go through the questions, you will not need to keep going back. All right, so let's look at this poem, Leisure by W.H. Davies. What is this life if full of care? We have no time to stand and stare, no time to stand beneath the bough and stare as long as sheep and cows, no time to see in broad delight streams full of stars like skies at night, no time to turn at beauty's glance and watch her feet, how they can dance, no time to wait till her mouth can enrich that smile her eyes began. A poor life this, if full of care, we have no time to stand and stare. So let's look at some of the questions that we have for this poem. When the poet says full of care in line 1, he means a life full of what? He means a life full of A, anger, B, duties, C, boredom, or D, happiness. And what the writer is speaking of is that when your life is full of care, it's really a matter of having a lot of responsibilities. When your life is filled with responsibilities, when it's filled with duties, there isn't time to relax. And this is, if you selected here, B as your answer, you are correct. When the poet says full of care in line 1, he means a life full of duties. It's not full of anger, boredom, or happiness. Let's look at the second question in this section. The poet uses the idea, stare as long as sheep or cows in line 4, because he thinks that we should A, relax beneath the balls, B, stop being busy and relax, C, gaze at the beauty of the skies, D, stand and observe our surroundings. What do you understand by that line, stare as long as sheep and cows? Well, if you have seen sheep or cows standing in a field staring while they chew their cud, it creates an idea of not a single care in the world. And that is the idea when the poet uses stare as long as sheep and cows. Not a care in the world. So which one of these options gives that idea of not having a care in the world and being able to really, based on the title of the poem, which speaks of leisure? Relax beneath the balls? Well, we get an idea, yes, it will be good to relax. B says stop being busy and relax? Or is it C, gaze at the beauty of the skies? Or D, stand and observe our surroundings? All of these can have that same idea because the sheep and cow do that, but the primary objective is to reduce the busyness. So our answer here is B. All of the other options speak about relaxing and gazing and taking it down. But the main idea here is that you need to slow it down so that you can relax. Third one, the poet implies that we need leisure in our life for it to be what? We need leisure for it to be vital, A, B, relaxing, C, important, or D, meaningful. The poet implies that we need leisure in our life for it to be, and the it here, this it here is for our life. The it does not refer to the leisure. It refers to our life. We need leisure in our lives for our lives to be meaningful. It makes no sense we are living and working and stressing and pushing and doing all of these things if we don't take time to rest. It's when you rest and relax, life becomes more meaningful. And that is what the poet is implying. Number 4. Streams full of stars like skies at night, in line 6, is an example of what? Now, I can assume that of all the literary devices in the world, similes are supposed to be the easiest to identify. But I will not make the assumption. I will, however, remind you that when you see a comparison between two unlike things using as or like, that tells you it is a simile. So that without even looking at your options as yet, you're comparing the streams full of stars being compared to the skies at night. We know the streams are on the earth, but the skies are in the sky. That's above. So that the skies are not the streams. But the poet is making that comparison. Streams full of stars like skies at night, and it's really looking at how the streams are able to reflect the stars in the sky at night. But he's using like, so that our answer here, that is an example of simile. In the poem, you have no time to turn, so on her eyes began. And this is the lines 7 to 10. And what it actually says, no time to turn at beauty's glance and watch her feet, how they can dance. No time to wait till her mouth can enrich that smile her eyes began. And this here is an example. Is it an example of A, pun, B, simile, C, personification, or D, onomatopoeia. And what you're getting here is that the elements, these have been personified, human qualities have been given, and we are seeing it when we speak about eyes and feet. Personification, our answer here is C. Our final question looks at, in which of the following lines does the poet answer the question asked in lines 1 and 2? In lines 1 and 2, the poet asks the question, and you have it on your smart devices. I'll read it over here. What is this life full of care? We have no time to stand and stare. The question is, what is this life if full of care? We have no time to stand and stare. He asks that question in lines 1 and 2. What is life if we don't have time to relax? And where do we get the answer? The answer is actually found in line 11 of the poem that says, a poor life that if full of care, we have no time to stand and stare. Towards the end of the poem, that is answered. If life does not involve resting and relaxing, it would be a poor life. So it's towards the end of the poem. So everything else in between is the poet's way of making his point, and those supporting details to show the importance of relaxing. So as we've come to the end and we've viewed this session, you should now be able to define poetry, examine the structure of poetry, discuss imagery, discuss figurative language, and most importantly, be able to go into your exam room and answer those questions, guaranteeing yourselves of examination success. Once again, I thank you for joining us as we've shared with you elements for preparation for your CSEC English A exam. And I hope that you could continue to tune in to the Tobago House of Assembly Division of Education, Innovation and Energy's e-learning program.